Hey everyone, it's Kate with the Wellness Pro show at Wellness Pro Academy, and I'm here with Ann Swanson, who has an amazing labor of love, and I say that as a 7-time author. Her new book, The Science of Yoga, which you can find at scienceof.yoga, and for those of you who can't spell science because it's an I before E, it's SCIENCEOF.yoga. We're going to do a deep dive, particularly for the yoga teachers, the yoga therapists, the yoga therapeutics people, and especially geared towards those who are working with the massive sector of the population known as the boomers, who are now falling apart due to chronic inflammation and being a little too heavy for that age and just the nature of getting older. We're going to dive deep into what's actually going on in the science behind yoga for those of you who are already using yoga in your therapy treatment program. So welcome to the show, Ann Swanson.
I'm so glad to be here. Yes, my book, Science of Yoga, has just come out with a second edition. First edition came out in 2019, and we did a fully updated second edition. It's like a purple cover. So you can find that at www.scienceof.yoga. But yeah, it's been around for a while, so some people might know it. It's just been updated now.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's an amazing book. It's big, it's beautiful. I feel like Donald Trump. It's big, it's beautiful, but it's not. It's an incredible book. And so let's just talk a little bit about what did you learn in the process of, the initial write and then the revisit?
Yeah. So it's been an interesting journey for me because I originally went to art school undergrad, and I was on a path to be a professional artist. And then for undergrad, I studied yoga in India and did a lot of studies of massage therapy and anatomy and physiology from a variety of perspectives. And I realized that I needed to have the science to be the best yoga teacher I could possibly be. So I went back and did the pre-med course load and studied from that perspective, worked in a cadaver lab. And so for me to come full circle and then work with some of the best artists in the world on Science of Yoga, Aaron Lewis was the illustrator for this book, who did this beautiful job with these CGI images that are 3D and dive deep into the body in all different perspectives, not just muscles and bones, every single system of the body, immune system and cardiovascular system, and some of the areas where we have the most compelling research but people aren't talking about. So to be able to make that visual was such a dream come true for me, to be sitting there drawing out what I wanted and then have the best artists in the world make it a reality and combine my passions of art and science was really coming full circle for me. I didn't expect it would come full circle in that way, but it's funny how those things happen, people think, oh, an art degree, that's not going to do you any good. But every little passion you have can come together and make sense in the end. And that's what I learned from this project. Revisiting it 5 years later was amazing after it sold over 500,000 copies and been translated into 15 languages, just to refine it and update it to the most recent research and read every single word in it and think about how to refine it was really amazing. Have that opportunity to go back is a dream, because when you're a writer, you write a book and then it's there and static. So it's great to see it as this living, developing creation.
Wow. 500,000 copies. So I love on the site how it says a must-have for yoga nerds, teachers, and science-minded newbies. So who do you see is it mostly the yoga teacher population that is buying the book, or who is?
The great thing about the book is it's for anybody who's fascinated by science and is a visual learner and a kinesthetic learner, because I see a lot of people on Instagram will tag me at scienceof.yoga is my Instagram handle. Also, they'll tag me with the book wide open on their mat and they're exploring the different poses. So it's really good for those kinesthetic learners, people who feel it in their body. So you can open it and do little mini experiments in your body. So I find a lot of practitioners, but of course, lots of teachers also buy the book. It's a great gift book for anybody that's skeptical and maybe not so sure about some of the claims in yoga and needs a little more convincing. This is a good book to show the exponentially growing research supporting this practice. It is not fringe, it is not woo-woo, it is really supported by science and research at this point.
Yeah, I'm into primal, so what are the things that we've been doing the longest? And so when I look at research, I'm like, it's such a blip on the screen of what I see as just eons of citizen data. right? And so when we look at, especially for those of us that are, we'll just say like over 50, we'll just take that subsector of the population that's between like 50 and 100, right? And we look at the
Or plus.
or plus, we look at the people that have been doing the practice and what's their experience of aging. Because the older I get, because I started yoga in my 20s, or early 20s. And the older I get, the more appreciation I have. And I think that's true of every practitioner I know. Like of every yoga practitioner I know. It's like there's just more bang for that buck with each spin around the sun.
Yeah. I have two comments. One is about how these ancient practices are being validated, as you said, by this little blip of the last 25, 30 years of research compared to the thousands of years. There's a reason that it stood the test of time. You know, it works. And a lot of the things we're seeing in the research are common sense. It's good for your heart. It's good for your brain. But to have those mechanisms to support it is how we can get yoga supported by policymakers into retirement communities, into hospitals, into jails, into populations that need to be served that are underserved at this point in time. So it is an importance, but yeah, it's quite intuitive what it's validating. It's validating what we all know and feel when we experience and practice it. It's good for your mental health. It's good for your sleep, all the things we've experienced. But to have that data really makes a big difference in getting the jobs as teachers, helping the people most in need. And then as far as aging, that's where we see some of the most promising research, because people think, oh, research, you know, what are you researching? It's not. Like young, thin, healthy, fit people for the most part. Who is in yoga research? It's mostly, the vast majority is clinical populations. People with Parkinson's, people with cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, people with arthritis. These are some of the biggest areas of research. People that are in aging populations that need modifications, that need adaptations to the poses in the chair. So it's not this what you see of yoga on billboards or on magazine covers that is in the research. The research is reflecting the aging population, and we're seeing great benefits for, as you mentioned, I liked in your intro, inflammation being a big part of that aging process. And we call it, I talked about it in Science of Yoga, inflammaging. Mm-hmm. You know, it accelerates aging. And we see that through yoga, we reduce key inflammatory markers like TNF-alpha or interleukins. These are measurable data that we can show and say, this has been reduced immediately after yoga and meditation practices, and then longer term, which has meaningful impacts on chronic pain, mental health, immunity. So it translates into being able to live a better life as we get older and tend to get more inflamed.
Yeah, well, or just the habits of modern cultures getting more inflamed, so we're all in that bucket, whether we're older or not. Like that's what I see so much. If I compare even my parents' parents, or my parents' parents, and what they were eating or what was food, and when they were going to bed and when they were waking up, and how much mental stimulation they had through screens versus now. And it's like the boomer population is firmly in an inflammatory culture in a way that their elders were clearly not. So whether it's linked to aging or whether it's just exacerbated by cultures, that we could go there. But I don't want to go there. I want to go a few other places. There's so much to talk about, Anne. All right. So let's get into yoga is a system, and it's a system that works on systems.
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
Right. So I think and this is where to me, it's like the research, unless it has a systems based approach, it's like it's going to pick up some cool things, but it might miss the bigger thing. I think that we as practitioners experienced, and anyone who's listening that's a yoga teacher, it's like it's like we know what we're getting. We know what we're getting from the mat. We know what we're getting from the cushion in a way that if we don't do it, we really know what we're getting, because then we don't get it if we don't do the practice. Right. And we get it the way we get it. And I think the way we would describe it is this whole, we'll use words like mind, body, spirit. It's like we'll use these ways that are trying to describe that, like the entire system of me went from being like shit show to like amazing, went from being like a bunch of different parts that were sort of at war with each other to feeling like a unified field of energy or a unified whole. So how is that translating in the science?
Yeah, so we as practitioners and people who are teachers know that yoga transforms lives. It's not uncommon to hear yoga literally saved my life. And these stories are very compelling. But science breaks things down into parts. So anatomy and physiology breaks it down into body systems, 11 or 12 or 10, depending on who you talk to, right? We made all this stuff up so that even the scientists debate about how many systems there are and where they overlap and where they're separated. But it's important to be able to separate things to understand them. But you have to have the key critical part at the end that I'll speak to in a moment. So the reason I wrote Science of Yoga in the format I did, and the reason I teach a course, the Science of Yoga certification in the format I do, is because when you break it down into systems, then you can understand what do we have for the evidence to support the cardiovascular system? What do we have to support immune system, urinary system, and reproductive? How can we break it down? And then ultimately, you have to have that last step of bringing it all together. And what is that unified whole that's affected? Because that's the yogic perspective, is to say, okay, we have all these parts and pieces, but you are more than your sum of your parts. You are something so much more, and the effects of this are so much more. So we break it down to understand the whole, and then we have to step back and look at it and see the whole that's affected positively through yoga. And the same with the system of yoga. That's why I liked what you said. The system of yoga affects the systems of your body, is because the system of yoga isn't just the poses, and neither is the research. Very, very few research studies are these 5 poses for this condition. That is very rare. Or this one pose, let's break it down and understand it. That's not what they're studying. They're studying the whole yoga practice that includes meditation, chanting, specific breathing practices, all of this as a class, what we think of as a class, right? And incorporating that and applying that for people with arthritis or depression or sleep issues, and seeing how the whole system affects us. So you can't just, we do try to sometimes break down individual parts of yoga, but it's the whole. It's not just the poses, because that you could just say that's just exercise. It's not just the breathing practices. We have lots of research emerging on breathing practices. Those are beneficial, but yoga itself with all of these components is where the magic really happens. So it's all the systems combined and all the systems of yoga combined too. That's how you get the magic.
It reminds me of, it's like wherever you start, like it's going to lead to the other parts of it. Like in Ayurveda and yoga, we say like you start, messing around with yoga enough, eventually you flip over the coin and find Ayurveda, and vice versa, right? Where we have, and those who don't know Ayurveda, it's the healing science that co-arose with yoga as a system of longevity, we might say, a system of medicine based on longevity. So when I think about, these different gateways in and how they lead to each other, whether it's like the chanting leading into the breath practices, or the asana or the actual poses leading into the meditation practice, these different parts, it brings me back to when I was in my first yoga teacher training was a 2-year Iyengar training in San Francisco. So it was in depth, and I didn't really know Ayurveda yet. Like I was in Ayurveda college at the time, but I wasn't like at any sense indoctrinated into the, when you're like, your body goes through the indoctrination of these systems, whether it's yoga or Ayurveda or Tai Chi or whatnot, where it's like very much a self-study of like an actual practice. And I just remember going to yoga in the morning, and I had a class at like 8 a.m. and I would eat cold cereal. Like that was like the habit that I had grown up with, that I hadn't stopped doing, like eating like cornflakes, essentially, like cornflakes and cow milk, right? Before yoga. And you're supposed to do yoga on an empty stomach. And it just reminds me how like the one part leads to the other part. Like you're supposed to practice yoga. It's in the teachings. It's like in the text. Like you're supposed to practice yoga on an empty stomach. And so I would go and not practice yoga on an empty stomach because I had food addiction, right? And I was like set in my standard American diet ways of like, you wake up, you eat breakfast, and then you do the thing. And every time, like 10 minutes into the practice on the mat, I was like, I gotta stop eating cornflakes before going to yoga. So like even on the sense of the how to come to the mat, like it eventually leads you to what you're doing before you even get to the mat and how to come to the mat smarter.
Yeah, your body knows, right? Your body was telling you, your intuition was telling you. And a lot of times we just don't listen to it, but yoga forces us to listen. We're there and we're being cued to listen, to pay attention to what the body's saying. And hopefully that bleeds into our everyday lifestyle. But on the other hand, from a practicality perspective, us modern yogis, we're integrating into society. And so, yes, to get that full benefit, going in with an empty stomach is really beneficial, right? That's what the aesthetics would do. And that's when I was in India, in the ashram, we'd go and we practice in the morning on an empty stomach. 3:34 in the morning, right? That's that lifestyle. But on the other hand, there's some benefits to having these little 5-minute breaks through the day. Right after I eat, I do yoga, specifically to reduce my blood sugar spikes and to get me more present so that I can move on to my next task, so that I'm not just running with my head cut off all day from one thing to the next. So I fit these little breaks. I'll do a sun salutation or a walking meditation after I eat. So there's ways that we can modernize it using what we understand from science, because there's been a plethora of research showing that these increased blood glucose spikes throughout the day can lead to a crash. And so I can use my asana practice to mitigate that and then help me be more present for my work. So there's this I guess it comes back to what the cover of my book says. It says, Science of Yoga, Anatomy and Physiology to Perfect Your Practice. I hated that. I resisted it so much. They do SEO to find words on covers of books. Authors don't
You had that stuff on that one.
Yeah, I've really resisted. And even with the second one, I asked if they could. They're like, no, it's already listed under that. That's the title of the book. We can't change the title of the book. It would be a new book. But, thinking of perfecting the practice, think about optimizing. That's the word I would want to say. It's I love your point of the traditionally, it's without food. But then it's but also what happens if I do it after I eat for little breaks through the day? How does that affect me? Can I do both and see their different effects? Just something on my mind, because I've been doing that a lot, especially because I was diabetic when I was pregnant. So I had to do exercise after each meal.
Yeah.
And that was what the doctor said, to keep those blood glucose spikes down. So that was something that really changed my life, and it helps me focus better too.
Oh, that's awesome. I loved hearing that. Okay, so let's talk a bit about, what, in terms of your research and writing in the book and in this background in therapeutics. Let's just talk a little bit about what you learned along the way, especially for, a lot of us who work in yoga. A lot of our clients are over 50, over 60, right? These are people that have more time. And actually, in my, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding, yoga really is designed more for the over 50 age, just in terms of having time to reflect, having time to go deep into whether it's this idea of an asana as a seat, having time for integration and reflection, as opposed to more of the householder time of life between, basically young adulthood and I would say pre-retirement, when we're actually upholding society in terms of having children, raising children, having businesses, working and in that more sort of busy phase of life.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about what were some of the big, maybe not the big ahas, but maybe that plus the what you already had a hunch on going in, and just were maybe the reaffirmations in terms of the research of the book. Yeah.
Well, yeah, to speak to your point of these different seasons of life, that it changes our yoga practice. So perhaps that more traditional practice will all be able to dive deeper into the long hours, the empty stomach, early morning yoga, all of that when we're older, right? Because we'll be able to hopefully carve out more time for it. But, that pitta stage of life, that where you're building something, where you're working a lot, I think it's really critical to have yoga in our lives, but it may look different, and that's okay. It can be modified. And also, we have different seasons to this Ayurvedic perspective through the year and even through the day. Like my yoga practice looks different in the morning than in the evening versus, winter and summer. So it's just kind of an interesting thing to look to, as those different seasons from an Ayurvedic perspective. And from a female perspective, my yoga practice was different while pregnant and now with a 6-month-old. And, that's something that changes and adapts. And that's what you see in the research, is that yoga is highly adaptable for a variety of populations. I mean, we do have research on yoga for kids, especially in schools and especially with ADHD. Those are two areas where we see a lot of promise with kids as helping with performance in schools, focus in schools, behavioral, social and emotional learning. And then we see yoga for a variety of health conditions that we deal with throughout the lifetime, but that tend to have more of them as we get older. And those clinical populations, that 50 plus, 65 plus, is where we see a lot of research emerging now for sure. Let me think, what is most surprising? I mean, I guess it wasn't surprising to me.
Yeah, or affirming, like just affirming.
Yeah, it's affirming. Yeah, is that a lot of people I find in the yoga world can be resistant to research for some of the reasons we mentioned earlier. Like, it works, it's ancient, like, why do we need that? But when we look at the researchers, I've met a lot of researchers going to these research conferences and seeing them present. Like, they're yogis. They're devoting their life to this exploration in a different way to apply their expertise and their skills to help further the field. So it's only with the intention of furthering the field. We're working with experts in the research studies to develop practices that are specific for those populations to help them, right? Because we see this potential. So I guess what I see is that the practices are really quite traditional. They are incorporating chanting and meditation is really critical part. It's not the, what do you say, like box yoga, that's out there and made to seem so simplified, and it's really still that traditional practice. That was something that was affirming to me, and I hope that it helps others understand that we're all looking at it from this different perspective. It's all different ways of exploring and understanding, and even the practice of yoga is another way to explore and understand ourselves. So is science. We're all on the same team. We're all trying to understand how to help more people with this.
Yeah. And just that different lens, right? Of like when you're running a study, it's such a different lens than when you're svadhyaya, when you're just in the self-study or the personal practice.
But then a lot of the studies, they incorporate svadhyaya as part of the homework and reading traditional texts and incorporating the yamas and niyamas. I teach a program called Yoga for Arthritis, and part of the way we teach the evidence-based protocol is incorporating the yamas and niyamas. So the philosophy can still be integrated. It doesn't have to be not spiritual if it's scientific. And I'm a deeply spiritual person. To me, spirituality is about being in connection with Mother Nature. And that's what yoga does to us. It brings us in union with nature, with our true nature. So seeing some of the research about spirituality and getting a chance to write about that, putting people in an MRI scanner that are experiencing higher spiritual states and seeing what's happening to their brain, what's different than those waking hours. Like, these are really interesting things to explore. And I find that the science supports spirituality as being a critical part of our growth and healing.
Reminds me of, have you read At the 11th Hour by Swami Rama?
No, I haven't.
He was, his bio is fascinating. He was basically born to the gurus and the Himalayas. They raised him from a baby. And so he was just born into the teachers of the teachers, right? Like into that was his family. And so he ends up, like, fast forward, I think by the time he's in his 40s, he ends up going to like a lab in like somewhere on the East Coast. I can't remember what it was. And they hook him up to all these machines, and he can like stop his heartbeat, and he can stop his breath, and he can raise and lower. Yep. He's complete autonomic.
I know of the research. It's not clinically gathered, but I know of the research. It's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, it was insane. And like no one had seen anything like that
Yes.
in this country ever. And they're just like, WTF, you know? Like, how do
Yes,
you
changing
raise?
temperature in one area of his hand versus the other area of the hand. Not just two separate hands, it's the different temperature in the same hand. He can close and open blood vessels strategically, and it just shows the power of the mind on your physical body, on your physiology, on your healing.
Well, and that like the developed mind, like there's so much that it's far, you know, and I noticed the same thing in like the Pulse Masters, and I was in India, and I studied Ayurvedic medicine for a long time, and you know, learned quite a bit about pulse, and then you go over, and you really are with like the masters, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's just these levels of the consciousness having penetrated physiology, and it's like the opposite of. It's like the opposite of in Ayurveda, like the ama conditions, like the excess quantity, poor quality tissue formation. This was like right quantity, amazing quality of tissue and consciousness moving through tissue and what we can perceive and control. Right, or perceive and influence, if we want to say that word.
Oh, I like
instead
that
of
word, influence. Yes.
control. Yama, right? Something around that word of being able to yama have influence over. And so this, to me, it's like there's this penetration of physiology that happens with yoga. Right, where consciousness is able to penetrate matter, and then it happens in this pulsation or synchronization that the prana, the breath body, right, where we're like moving into these experiences cellularly of just it's like focus on the breath, or like inhale, stretch your hands to the sky, exhale, fall forward, touch the floor, and in this unification that's happening, state of consciousness changes, brainwave state change, and there's an experience of the unified field that's otherwise very hard to access, maybe impossible.
Yeah. And that's why I like breaking down and understanding each of those separate parts.
Yeah.
I think you described it so beautifully. Like, what's happening with the brainwaves? What's happening with the activity and the specific networks of activity in your brain? What's happening with your blood pressure? How does that change as we move through sun salutations? How does that affect, so many people just focus on the muscles and bones. I feel like that's what all the Instagram and social media is about.
Well,
the
and
right
yoga
way to do
teacher
this
training
is-
programs,
Yeah,
right?
it's muscles
it's
and
all
bones.
just like name muscles and bones, and I'm like, I could not, I can't. I don't
That's
want
not the
to.
most important part of the science.
It's
And-
missing it.
Yeah, and that's what I saw in the yoga anatomy world at the time when I wrote this book 5 years ago, is everybody was focusing on muscles and bones, and I wanted to really dive into the other systems equally to muscles and bones, not just focus on the muscles and bones. There's so much more happening. Yes, yoga has all the benefits of exercise, and that's profound. There's so many benefits of exercise. And then we add all the benefits of meditation. We have really quite a growing body of research supporting meditation, even separately, not just yoga meditation, but Buddhist meditation and a variety of different backgrounds. And we add all of those benefits, and then we add all the breathwork benefits, and we can see how it just all comes together. So I like breaking it down into these parts as you described. I love thinking of it as sun salutations. That's one area I've been really fascinated recently is sun salutations and all that it has to offer. All the parts and pieces come to a whole, and they can be infinitely adapted. When I taught in a retirement community, I would teach sun salutations and say I'd go from one class to the next. Some classes were fully in the wheelchair. So our sun salutation might just be arms up, inhale, exhale, hands to your heart. Inhale, arms up. And maybe I had stroke survivors in there who were just lifting one arm and visualizing the other arm. And then, I teach also in the assisted living where we'd be leaning on the chair. We'd not come down to the floor, but we'd lean on the chair and do sun salutations that way or against the wall. And so it can be infinitely adapted to get the benefits. And I'll tell you, the people that were bringing just their arms up into a big V, you got 100-year-old in there with his arms up in a big V, that brings your blood pressure up. Yeah. Just as much as that 25-year-old going into the full sun salutation day on the floor, right? So it doesn't matter how it looks, it can be adapted to affect all the systems for that 100-year-old and for that 25-year-old in a similar way, improving their immunity, changing their brain waves, all of the benefits we're speaking of.
So let's talk a bit about arthritis. Just give the download on, and we're gonna target this more to like yoga teachers helping their clientele with arthritis, and what you think they should be informed of or talking about.
Yeah, so arthritis is so common. 1 in 3 people are estimated to have arthritis. So if you teach yoga or you are in a yoga class or you have a body, eventually you're going to have arthritis, but people in the class have arthritis.
Well, actually, let me pause. Let me just cut you off there for a second. So I recently interviewed Dr. David Midow of San Antonio Physical Therapy, and he was sharing that the average age of arthritis diagnosis right now is 52. So that age, right, it's getting younger and younger. So I think even maybe yoga teachers might be seeing people that don't know they have arthritis.
Well, that's the diagnosis. 1 in 3 is estimated that have it, that are not diagnosed. Or you'll have just commonly, oh, my wrist hurts. They think it's arthritis. They haven't done imagery. There's not an official diagnosis. Necessarily. Like, I have arthritis. I've had arthritis since I was in college. So it's also not necessarily by age. And I have friends that had arthritis since they were a toddler, right? Arthritis is an umbrella term that includes some of these inflammatory autoimmune disorders that can happen, since you're a small child. Like Selena Gomez has lupus. That's a type of arthritis. And she has had that most of her life. So it is this umbrella term. But when most people are talking about arthritis, they're talking about osteoarthritis, that wear and tear, which increases with age. And I have it in my wrists. I think that's one of the most common types that affects yoga practice. A lot of people think, oh, I can't do yoga because I can't get on the floor because it hurts my wrist to go to down dog and plank, and I have to modify for that and adapt to the poses. Another area that's really common is the knees. That would be the most common, and hips, these weight bearing. And as we get older and have more weight, it can be more of impact. The pain, especially holding people back from exercising. And they used to say, don't exercise with arthritis, just rest. And then a plethora of research came out that said that exercise improves arthritis. We want to move and we want to strengthen. So it's not just about restorative yoga and calming yoga, which is helpful, right, to mitigate the stress and the inflammation. Arthritis, itis means inflammation of the joint. Arth is the joint. So it's not just mitigating the inflammation, that's a key part. It's also strengthening around the joints. So I do a lot of strengthening work at all ages. We can strengthen at all ages in order to help with joint pain. A lot of people just feel like they can't do yoga because of their arthritis. So we had to get past that initial barrier and modify for those individuals.
Yeah. So in terms of some of the studies on these joint surgeries, right, like showing that how much like bone on bone contact, right, there is. And I just want to go deep into arthritis for a minute before we go more into therapeutics.
Oh, that's my specialty, so I'm happy to do so.
Okay,
As somebody
awesome.
who dealt with arthritis from a very young age, and it's affected my life. I went on a trip around the world to understand what's going on. And that's ultimately, I work with people with chronic pain and arthritis for this reason.
So wait, I just want to say, so we can see like two people with the exact same x-rays. One has pain,
Yeah.
one doesn't have pain. So what's going
My grandpa
on?
is 100 years old, and he just recently started to have pain in his joints. He's had arthritis for a long, long time, right? So my grandpa doesn't experience pain like I had pain in my early 20s. What's up with that? That's not fair. Well, we can see that there is zero correlation between the damage of the tissue and the amount of pain.
Okay, stop. Everyone.
Zero.
I'm going to say it again. Say it again.
Zero correlation. So you could be bone on bone and have no pain, or you could have very little arthritis and have a massive amount of pain. Pain is very complex, which is why that yoga is so effective at addressing pain, because pain is multifaceted. It's biological, as most people think, maybe the bone on bone or the need of a joint replacement. So it has that component, and that can contribute, but it's not the main factor. The main factor is your perception of the signals going on. So it's I hate to say it's in the head, because you're not making it up, but it is your brain's misinterpretation of a signal that gets amplified the more you focus on it. My grandpa is the most positive attitude and doesn't focus on those sort of things, right? I don't know what his secret is. I wish I could get to the essence of his secret. Don't we all wish? But like, I think that attitude has a big part of it, but also relationships. So being multifaceted, yoga improves our relationships and relationships with other people. We build community, and that's really beneficial for pain, as well as relationship with yourself. You know, that self-blame around the pain. And a lot of times when the pain starts coming out, because with arthritis, it tends to flare. And with chronic pain conditions, it comes and goes based off the barometric pressure, based off of what you eat. For me, it's very inflammation, what I ate based, or lack of sleep. I can't drink alcohol, it causes the pain. You start to see these correlations as you get more and more into yoga. Those correlations are real. You feel them. Is that your lifestyle is more heavily correlated with the pain than the amount of damage, right? So it's multifaceted, and yoga works so well for it, because if it's a misinterpretation from your brain, then working with mindfulness and meditation and rebuilding the critical gray matter areas that degrade from pain with yoga and meditation is the exact same areas that are degrading from chronic pain and anxiety. The associated anxiety and depression are the exact same areas we see the most growth and the most connections built through meditation. So it's from multiple perspectives, we can see yoga is a really effective pain management tool. And a lot of times it can get rid of the pain.
It reminds me of, I think it was either Deepak Chopra or his partner, his late partner, David Simon, who said that, like, if meditation were a drug and a doctor didn't prescribe it, they would be sued for malpractice. Yeah. That's really what I'm getting in what you're saying with. So what we know about pain and pain science is that it's not correlating with damage, and that there's this buffer, right, where we have this like hyper signaling, and you're saying in that hyper signaling into the brain, that part of the brain is going to atrophy.
Or some parts of the brain actually build connections that we don't want, like the amygdala related to fear that builds connections, and we want actually a smaller amygdala. So it depends on the area of the brain we're speaking of, but yes, some areas.
But that gray matter part where you're saying that it's like, it's not going to
like the prefrontal cortex. Let's talk about that one, because it's a simple one. Yeah. That tends to atrophy. And so people in pain tend to have more difficulty focusing. They have more brain fog. They can't plan and organize and in the same capacity as they maybe used to be able to. But meditation rebuilds the prefrontal cortex and a variety of other areas, but that one's a cool one to think about. Is we all want to improve our ability to focus. Another area is the hippocampus. That's the memory. We all want to improve our memory too. And when we deal with a lot of pain, memory is affected deeply. So the good news is it's not permanent. It can be reversed through lifestyle and through yoga.
So I just want to like double and triple click down on this, because in Wellness Pro Academy, a lot of what we do is we help wellness pros of all varieties develop a club around their business. The idea is like annual recurring revenue, the idea of like building relationship over time, because transformation requires time and relationship stabilizes the transformation. And so just shifting the business, we're basically like a business model company for wellness pros of like, here, we'll show you how to do it. Because, I mean, I'm just thinking of like, say a yoga teacher's listening and they're looking at their clientele and they're like, yeah, like everyone's between 45 and 75 that I'm working with, primarily female, because that's the market, right? And then we're thinking like, oh wait, they're coming into class. This is like, to me, like if I just remember my days as a yoga teacher and studio owner, they come into class and they're complaining about this and that. Oh, this knee has this problem, and boy, I can't remember anything anymore. And they're often just in this, we'll say modified, but not that modified standard American diet and lifestyle, right? Where what they're doing day to day, maybe they're, after yoga class, they go home, they have dinner, they drink a glass of wine or two, they watch Netflix, they stay up late, then that ruins their meditation practice the next morning. And now they're behind the 8 ball again, like trying to like get through all the day. And then they go to yoga class again, right? And so it's like the diet and lifestyle is not keeping up with the inputs from modern culture. So we need to really help this person maybe achieve their dream, which might be to be able to have fun, right? Enjoy their life, enjoy their body, enjoy if they're in retirement, if they're grandparents, if they're parents, like enjoy what they really want to do it's going to require these diet and lifestyle changes. So that's going to require time, transformation, commitment, and it's easier to do these things together. That part of community that you just mentioned, that the community is a natural part of what happens when we do yoga together, because we're right. There's like a bigger thing that's happening. It's easier to do it together. It's easier to stay in Shavasana for 10 minutes. It's easier to center ourselves for 5 minutes at the beginning of practice. It might be easier to approach doing handstand at the wall, which we might not be able to do on our own, or if we're just, doing a yoga video on YouTube, that there's something greater that happens when we're moving together, breathing together, sitting together, and doing some of these radical diet and lifestyle changes, which might include like going to bed earlier and waking up earlier and maybe having less alcoholic substance so that we can actually have a bit of a meditation practice in the morning. That like these are the things that will actually reverse arthritis. I think for some people listening, the yoga teachers listening, like this is big, what we're talking about. If we're actually talking about like getting to the root of the root.
Well, we can reverse damage from the pain. We can't reverse arthritis. Unfortunately, that damage to the joint can't be reversed unless you have the joint replacement, which a lot of my clients do have a joint replacement. And what we're doing is prepping them to either delay it or to improve their strength so they can get through it better and have a quick recovery. But yes, we are reversing certain aspects of the arthritis through improving our connectivity in our brain, for sure. And those lifestyle changes are made the more you practice yoga. We see that people who practice yoga and meditate make better lifestyle choices. So indirectly, it doesn't necessarily have to be directly. It just happens when you're in community and you see other people doing it. And after you do a yoga class, you generally don't want to eat a really greasy meal at McDonald's, right? You want to eat something healthy and nourishing. So you start to be able to listen to your body more. So those changes naturally happen. I work a lot with people one-on-one that are with these complex conditions to have that transformation, because people need a little bit more of a hand holding. And so I think probably a lot of the listeners here too also work with people one-on-one to help them make that transformation and those goals, because when they're ready, they'll come to that sort of commitment. A lot of people aren't ready. And the hard thing is when they're family members and they're not ready, or there's somebody very close to you, really close friends. But ultimately, that readiness has to come from them. And we can trust that the yoga practice over time will do its magic with that. It improves lifestyle decisions if you keep practicing and keep sticking to that practice.
Yeah, that kind of brings us back to the whole idea of like ahimsa, or the yamas and niyamas, as part of like it's a naturally like if we look at this as happening as a naturally arising, like what if yoga, instead of feeling like maybe an imported practice, is actually just like a more naturally arising state of being that's interconnected. You open one door, it leads to the next one. To me, it's a really curious thing that like we may start yoga kind of like with me and the cornflakes, right? Where it's like there's something that's not working for me, but I can't seem to stop. But then eventually the yoga kicks in and it makes the thing stop. Right? Or with ahimsa, this idea of like doing self-harm by like whatever. After yoga, we don't feel like having like a big greasy meal or a lot of alcohol, right? Like there's something that actually there's how are we saying that in terms of like the Western physiology, like this? I would say it's like a higher consciousness.
Well, I mean, how we study it is one study that comes to my mind, I believe, was college students, and it was asking about their smoking and drinking behaviors while they're before, during, and after the yoga program versus not. And it improved their smoking and drinking behaviors. So surveys is how we were finding for that sort of thing. And that's a big area. I mean, smoking and drinking affects your life greatly. So if you can improve those things. Sleep was another thing, was on that survey, I believe. So what are our sleep patterns? So yeah, that's how we study it. And then,
But you know what I mean? Like, what's the measurement for higher consciousness? Like, how are we going to measure that? Are we going to measure that in like brainwave states, like gamma waves or theta waves, or?
We try. Brainwaves is interesting, but I worked on my most recent book, Meditation for the Real World, with Dr. Sarah Lazar, who's a Harvard neuroscientist who does a lot of research with MRI scanners, some of the most cutting edge research in the field. And she's like, everybody obsesses with brainwaves, but it's not really like that sound of science. So I think right now a lot is being talked about brain network activity and the cohesion between the different areas of the brain. Like 10 years ago, it was all about just the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, as we spoke of earlier. And now it's about these cohesive activities of areas and how we want to turn down certain networks and turn up activity in other networks, turning down networks and like the default mode network that has to do with mind wandering and not being present, and turning up the central executive network that has to do with really being present in your highest self. And we can see that aligns with yoga philosophy. That's been one area I see closely aligns. And in the research, we find that in a prestigious article in the journal Science, they found that 47% of our waking hours were spent mind wandering. That's when that default mode network was taking over. But what was so interesting about this study was they found that not a correlation, but a causation between when your mind was wandering and you weren't present with whatever you were doing. Didn't matter what you were doing. Washing the dishes, having sex, doesn't matter what you're doing. When you're somewhere else in your mind than there, you were unhappy. It was causational to unhappiness. It's so in alignment with yogic and Buddhist and a variety of other traditions, is that being present is the secret to happiness, right? Being present is the secret to alleviating suffering. So it's not new information, but to have this data from very large studies that are analyzing it in a very, very rigorous way is profound to me. So there's many ways we can look at it, but those are some of the interesting ways I see is MRI scanners, understanding the networks of activity. We're still exploring that, and that's the great thing about science is we'll always be asking those questions and continuing to explore from different pathways as we have more acute tools to measure these things. Just as when we practice yoga, as you mentioned earlier in this conversation, as we get older, we maybe have more time and wisdom and depth to our practice. We're fine-tuning those instruments and developing new instruments of exploration to be able to understand ourselves from that, or sharpening, focusing the lens as we get older. So I think the same thing is happening with science as we refine the studies and dive deeper.
That's cool. That's really cool. So we've been talking a little bit about people starting yoga when they're older. I just want to also talk to the accumulation, like the practice, how, especially with yoga, because I've been working with yoga teachers for about 20 years, just in my business in one way or another. Either they're studying Ayurveda with me or they're learning how to have a sustainable business with me. So one pool or the other. I've had the privilege of working with people that have had serious practices over time and have, really I would say a large part of their income has gone to study. Right. So whether they're flying to India to study with a guru, or whether they're just taking time at retreats, et cetera, or just taking time in their own learning practices, et cetera, that they've invested a disproportionate amount of time and money, and I think both are significant, into self-knowledge, right? Into actually doing the practices with people who know more than them. And I see a huge rift in that population in how they've invested versus the mainstream population that's maybe relied on, I hate to call it healthcare because it's just sick care, and I think we're all pretty clear that that's how the system's dialed in, funded by pharmaceutical companies, right? That there's a real difference in investing time and investing money and being with people who simply are more embodied, who have more embodied practices that are anti-aging or longevity practices. And so within these two different ways, these two different data pools, what I find is those that have invested time and energy younger is they don't regret it. They don't look back and say I wish I had, that was a waste of time. I wish I had started that. I could have started that in my 50s, or I could have started in my 60s. Instead they're I was really glad that I started meditating, doing yoga as a teenager or as a young adult or as a mid-career adult, because my gosh, I can see that it's a cumulative effect. So any studies on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, and I feel the same too, because I started young out of necessity because I was extremely anxious to the point of passing out at inopportune times, and it dealt with a lot of anxiety and type A perfectionist. So I now can look back at my challenges and my pain and say I'm grateful for it, that it led me to devoting my life to this, right? Otherwise I would have I don't know, I'd become an artist, gone another path. I don't know what I would have done, but the pain led me to be able to help others in pain now. And so many of us with this passion career, we don't regret the studies that we've done and going to India and studying with people with more knowledge than us, because it feeds our own healing too. So studies on remind me again.
It's a big question mark. So it's tied to investment. It's tied to time and money investment into learning yoga and practicing over time. So I'll say people
practicing over time, yes.
20, 30, 40, 50 years versus those who are just starting.
Yes. So there are some studies on long-term meditators. That comes to my mind first and foremost is we have more meditation research than we have yoga research. So some of it's more robust. And there are some that with yoga, but they're not coming to my mind at the same depth. So long-term meditators 50-year-old meditators who have been meditating for a long time. It's not just the last 8 weeks, which we have a lot of studies on that. 8 weeks makes a difference, right? That's a typical research protocol, is a transformation happens within 8 weeks. But long-term 50-year-old meditators have similar brain structure, similar brains as 25-year-old non-meditators. And that's some of the research from Dr. Sarah Lazar, who I spoke of earlier. And so we can see that over time, it definitely compounds. And I love that question, though. It makes me want to dive deep into the research to categorize it in a different way. Which ones are the short-term practices? Which ones are looking at these longer-term? It's harder to study the longer-term because we have to do it by survey and memory. And a lot of people practice, I've been practicing 25 years, but there was 6 years that I stopped, So it's really hard to standardize it. So that's why we have less of that, it's by memory. Most of the data is after 8 weeks of practice, what changes do we see?
Yeah. Well, and to me, it kind of goes back to that citizen data component, or the looking at anecdotal data over time, right? Of who are the people that have been who's in the Sangha, the Gurukula, these spiritual communities. And even in India, with a caste system, that we had a casted class of people that were doing the practices more than other castes of people. It's kind of wild. Yeah. But what I find more than not is every wellness pro I've ever asked this question to, they have zero regret over time and money invested. And the earlier they started, they're worth every penny. And usually by the time, say they're 20, 30 years in, they've invested somewhere around $30,000 to $50,000.
Oh, I've done way more than that.
Right?
Way more. My graduate degree in yoga therapy.
Right?
Right there
but then
is
you
25.
Compare that to people 30. Who are I don't want to pay out of pocket to do X, Y, and Z. And it's okay, well, that's an entirely different body. That's an entirely different mind, body, spirit experience in your 50s, 60s, and 70s. And these people over here, none of them regret it.
No, I definitely don't regret it. And you'll connect with the teachers that inspire you. And so keep following and connecting with and studying with the people who speak to you. We're all saying the same things. I'm saying it from a scientific lens that's also respecting tradition and spirituality, but somebody else may say it from an Ayurvedic lens, right? I don't have as much experience. I have the surface level of Ayurveda, so that's not the lens I'm speaking from. So take it from different lenses that speak to you, and you'll develop your own, lens.
Yeah, I love that. That's great to end on. So I want to point people to your site and then the book as well. Yeah. So there's a free yoga survival kit. It's an ebook, and that's on go to scienceof.yoga, and there you'll find the whole world of Anne, and you can go into her email list for yoga teachers out there. She also has courses for yoga teachers, so please get on her email list and get in Anne's world. And it's just been really fun to be in your brain for a hot minute.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation. I hope to come back in the future.
All right, you guys. Hello, listeners. So I have created for the wellness pros out there who listen to this show, the Wellness Pro Launchpad, and I'll get you in for free. Just go to wellnesspro.academy/launchpad, LAUNCHPAD, Launchpad, and then just fill out the form and we'll get you right into this school classroom in here. And in the Launchpad, it's really cool. Like, you get to see yourself as the hero in the path of the Wellness Pro, and then your client's transformation and A to B, and your vibe and your brand, your investment story, and design the journey for your clients, patients, or students, and then how to price from results. So these lessons are super short. They're each about 10 minutes, and you'll have a reframe on how to launch and scale the next phase of your wellness career. So wellnesspro.academy/launchpad. And then I'm on the inside. If you really want to launch, you can, like, your next phase of growth as a wellness pro, then you can talk to me. See you soon.